Today we're going to talk on the subject of dedicated. We are dedicating a little baby here this morning, so I thought, you know what, I started to kind of question this word dedicated, and I began to look a bit more into it, and so this is what we're going to look at this morning for the next kind of 20 minutes or so, the whole subject of dedicated. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, 1 Samuel chapter 1, there is the story of a woman by the name of Hannah. And Hannah has a husband by the name of Elkanah. But back in those days, the way that it worked was husbands tended to have more than one wife. And so Elkanah, he's got a couple of wives. The other wife is, you call her Peninnah. And what was happening was the other woman, she was able to bear children, but Hannah was barren. And back in those days, in Bible times, whenever you didn't have a child, if you couldn't bear a child, if you were barren, then you were kind of looked down on by society. It was always looked upon as the woman's fault that you couldn't produce children for your husband. And so what was happening was this other woman was beginning to mock and make fun of Hannah. And Hannah was distraught. She was distraught at the fact that she could not bear children for her husband Elkanah. But Elkanah, he loved Hannah. Hannah was the first wife of Elkanah, and he loved her passionately. And what would happen was Elkanah he'd be gathering the food, and he would give food to Peninnah and to her children, but then he would take a lot more food and give it to Hannah. He loved Hannah more than what he loved the other woman. But Hannah was distraught because she was barren, because she couldn't produce any children for her husband. Very often what we find throughout the Bible is that women who are barren tend to produce amazing babies. Babies that grow up to be absolutely amazing men and women of God. We think of women like Elizabeth. Elizabeth was married to Zechariah, and Elizabeth, she was barren. She couldn't bear any children, and she gives birth to a baby boy. Call him John. He turns out to be John the Baptist, the guy who Jesus refers to as Israel's greatest prophet, the guy who prepares the way for Jesus, for the Savior of the world. And so there are women who are barren. You've even got crazy circumstances where you've got a young girl by the name of Mary who is incapable of conceiving a child because she has not partaken in that activity that is required to produce a child. You know what I'm talking about. And then she gives birth to Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. And so there are many circumstances throughout the Bible where women are barren and they're struggling to produce. Abraham and Sarah. And Sarah, she's barren and she can't produce any children. And yet God gives Abraham a promise that he's going to be blessed with a multitude, with tons and tons and tons of offspring. And there's this promise that is given to Abraham. But Sarah's barren, and then Sarah gives birth to Isaac, who gives birth to Jacob, who gives birth to the 12 tribes of Israel. Not the men, but their wives. Just so we're clear on that. And so we have this circumstance here where Hannah is barren. She cannot produce children, and she is a mess because of it. She's an absolute mess because she can't produce any children. And what would happen is every year, her and Elkanah, her husband, and they would go up to a place called Shiloh every year where they would sacrifice to God. Every year they would do this. They would go through this ritual and this routine of going up to Shiloh every year and going to the temple and making a sacrifice to God. And so this one year, they go up, and Hannah, again, she's so distraught, she's so messed up that she can't even eat. And her husband comes to her and says, listen, am I not worth more than 10 sons? You know, because men don't understand women's emotions. Men are just like, get over it, you know, let's get on with it, you know. But the woman's a mess, and he's saying to her, am I not worth more than 10 sons? And she's trying to explain it to him. I'm a mess. I can't give you any children. I can't give you any sons. Hannah is a mess. And in 1 Samuel chapter 1, just reading from the Message translation, it says, she pulled herself together. She slipped away quietly and entered into the sanctuary. The priest Eli was on duty at the entrance to God's temple in the customary seat. Crushed in soul, Hannah prayed to God and cried inconsolably. Then she made a vow. She says, "O God of the angel armies, if you'll take a good hard look at my pain, if you'll quit neglecting me and go into action for me by giving me a son, I'll give him completely, unreservedly to you. I'll set him apart for a life of holy discipline." So Hannah, she's a mess. She's inconsolable. She goes to the church. She goes to the temple. She goes to the sanctuary. And she's crying her eyes out. She's bawling her eyes out. She's a mess. And she begins to pour her heart out to God. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation or a circumstance where you're like, this is just far beyond my control. And I need something done about this situation. And you're on your knees crying out to God because you know God's the only one that can move in this circumstance. And you pour your heart out to God. We had an amazing weekend with the Monte on Friday night and Saturday morning and Saturday night. And on Friday night, we're talking about prayer, and he's going through the different types of prayer, how that you got petition and supplication and intercession. And this was Hannah pouring out her heart and intercession and supplication to God. I need you to move, God. This is a mess. I need you to do something, God, because the situation and the circumstance that I'm going through, I can't do anything about it. I've tried and I've tried and I've tried, and it's not changing. God, if you would just look on my pain, if you just find it in your heart to take action and to move and to do something, God, please just move. That's the cry of our heart. Quit neglecting me, God. Move into action. If you give me a son, I'll give him back to you. You ever pray a prayer like that? Again, where it's just beyond your control and you're just like, God, if you do this, then I'll do this. And you make a promise to God. You're trying to kind of like bargain with God. God, if you get me, get me through this circumstance. If you just move and do something, then I'll go to church a lot more. I'll not miss the start of church. I'll get there on time. And if you do this, God, then I'll do this. Maybe God moves and God intervenes and there's an answer to prayer. But we don't hold up our end of the bargain. We slip back into our own routine and our own rituals and our own way of living, and we forget the promise that we made to God. Hannah poured out her soul to God. God, if you give me a son, I'm broken and I'm in pieces. If you give him to me, just let me bear one son. I'll give him back to you, God. I'll give him back to you. It's a promise that she gives to God. I'll set him apart for a life of holy discipline. Goes on down and it says, before the year was out, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, meaning I asked God for him. So what happens is, as she's lying crying in the temple and she's pouring her heart out to God, the Bible says that she's not even at times able to get the words out. And she's just mouthing, God, please give me a son, God. Please give me a son. God, please, I need you to move. I need you to move, God. She can't even bring herself to no more to be able to speak out and to scream and to shout. And she's, God, I need you so much. I need you to give me a son. She's pouring her heart out to God. The tears are streaming down her face. And then the priest by the name of Eli, he sees her. And he sees her down on her knees. And he sees her lips moving. And there's no words coming out. And Eli's first thoughts is, there's a drunk woman in my church. That's his first thoughts. And he approaches her and he actually rebukes her and says, what are you doing in here, drunk woman? Sober up, woman. And then she begins to pour out her heart to Eli. You ever be in that circumstance again where you'll just talk to anybody that'll listen? Because you're kind of thinking, and just sharing this, then hopefully this will help bring an answer. So you'll just speak to whoever will listen. And she begins to share what's going on in her life to Eli, the priest. Eli thinking that she's drunk, and Hannah's like, no, I'm not drunk. I'm desperate. I'm desperate. I'm pouring my heart out to God here. I need a son. I haven't born any children to my husband, and I need a son. And Eli prays over her and says, I pray that God will give you a son. And so there's an answer to her prayer. There's an answer, and she conceives, and she bears a son, and she calls him Samuel. It goes on down, and again, they're coming every year to Shiloh to bring the sacrifice to God. Hannah made a promise. Hannah was dedicated to her promise. It goes down towards the end of chapter 1 in 1 Samuel, and it says that Hannah brought the child to Eli, said, excuse me, sir, would you believe that I'm the very woman who was standing before you at this very spot praying to God? I prayed for this child, and God gave me what I asked for, and now I have dedicated him to God. He's dedicated to God for life. Then and there, they worshiped God. Hannah recognized God has given me this child, and I made a promise to God. And so, Eli, I'm dedicating this baby. I'm dedicating this boy to God. I'm dedicating this boy to the kingdom. I'm dedicating this boy to you and to the temple. I made a promise, and I'm giving him back to God. I'm holding up my end of the bargain. I'm holding up what I have promised. Dedication, let me break this down very quickly. Let me give you two quick definitions. Definition number one, dedicated is to be set apart and consecrated to a deity or for a sacred purpose. That's what we've just read here. That's what happened to Samuel. Samuel was set apart. Samuel was consecrated. Samuel was dedicated to God, given over to God. That's what Hannah did with Samuel. Another definition can be to offer something formally to a person or to a cause or in a testimony. Sometimes you ever be at a concert or something like that there, and whoever's singing will say, I want to dedicate this next song to my mother or to my father or to my parents, or I want to dedicate this next song to a group of people. Well, if you're reading a book, then very often at the beginning of the book is dedicated to someone. The book is dedicated to a mother or to a father, or the book is dedicated to a family. The book is dedicated to a friend. So dedication brings kind of the connotation of singularity. And that whenever you dedicate something, then you dedicate it to one person, or one thing is dedicated, or one person is dedicated. Because there's something unique about that circumstance and about that situation. So whenever someone is dedicating a song, then they say, I want to dedicate this song to so-and-so. It's one person. So that there's something unique about that situation. There's something unique about what's going on there in the singularity. It is just for that one person. There's something that separates that one person from everybody else. Or if it's dedicated to one group of people, then there's something that separates that one group of people from everybody else. There's this concept of singularity whenever it comes to dedication. So as we dedicate little Faya, what we are doing is we are setting her apart, consecrating her before God. She's separated from everybody else in the room. This is just about her being dedicated to God, being given over to God, being consecrated before God, and saying, God, she's yours. Will you protect her? Will you watch over her? Will you bless her? Will you be with her all the days of her life? She is separated. Samuel was dedicated, given over to God and to the responsibilities within the temple, and he was brought up within the temple. You see, Hannah understood, yes, I'm holding up my end of the bargain. I'm dedicating him to God. But I think Hannah also had an understanding that the best place to bring up a child is in church. And that there is a process involved. The dedication is not just a one-time thing, but the dedication is a process. And so Hannah wasn't just saying, okay, I'm going to dedicate him to God. I'm going to pray over him. That's him dedicated. And then I'm going to bring him up whatever way that I choose. Hannah understood that if I'm going to dedicate my little one to God, then I need to bring him up in the ways of God. Dedication is a process. Dedication takes a long time. Dedication is in some way a lifetime commitment We are all dedicated to something, and Stephen and Denise are dedicated to the rearing of little baby Faya. He is dedicated as a father. That's my daughter. I'm going to raise her. I'm dedicated to her well-being. I'm dedicated to her good. And so there's a process involved. The second definition of dedication, and it will be coming to a close very soon, is to be wholly committed to something. Wholly committed to something as an ideal, a political cause, or a personal goal. Wholly committed to something. Hannah made a promise, and Hannah was dedicated to her promise. She was wholly committed to the promise that she made to God, and so she followed through on the promise that she made to God. And many of us have been dedicated to different causes. I hate to say this, but I've been dedicated to Liverpool since the mid-80s, and it's killing me. It's breaking me in pieces. It could be worse. It could be dedicated to Rangers Football Club and the stuff that they've been through, young or what. But we still stay dedicated, don't we? No matter how bad our football teams treat us, we're still there the following week checking up on the scores. We're dedicated to our football team, man. Sometimes dedicated more to our football team than what we are to, well, I'm speaking on behalf of you, so it's not talking about me. Sure, it's not. Sometimes we can be more dedicated to the football team than we can be to the women in our lives. How is it that, men can get divorced and yet still support the same team? You could be 30 years supporting the same team and they haven't won a thing, yet you're still dedicated to them and go through 2 and 3 divorces at the same time. We know what it is to be dedicated. We know what it is to have that passion for something. In other words, whenever we're dedicated, we give ourselves over to that single cause of whatever it is. You see, whenever I think of dedication, I think of sports personalities, of sports people who know what it is. We talk about, they're dedicated. I think of like boxers. Of athletes, and they're training for the Olympic Games, or boxers getting ready for a world title fight or for any kind of fight. And they go into this period of training that requires dedication. I love watching the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff whenever it comes to sports. I love watching what goes on within the training and what takes place behind the scenes, because we always see them kind of coming out into the boxing ring and getting ready to fight. But we forget that there is this whole process of dedication behind the scenes, morning, noon, and night, of stuff that they have to go through to punish themselves in order to get prepared for what it is that they're going into. And so I love watching what they go through, and so there's sacrifice involved in dedication. Dedication requires sacrifice, requires it's not normal. Things that people that are dedicated to something, then they've got to do stuff that is in some way abnormal. It breaks from the norm. So whenever I'm looking at boxers, and I see boxers at 6 o'clock in the morning, even guys that are part-time boxers are trying to make it. They're trying to make it as a boxer, but they're dedicated to what it is they're trying to achieve. And so even though they're maybe working a full-time job, they're still up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they're going out for a run. And they'll do their run, they'll come back, and then they get their breakfast, and then they'll go out and they'll do a job. They'll work a day's job. And then after their work, then they go to the gym, and they'll do the weights, and they'll do the running, and they'll do their cardio. They're dedicated. And I love watching stuff behind the scenes. I love watching about Usain Bolt and Mo Farah and the training that they go under in order to prepare for what it is that they're going to be getting involved in. And we say that's dedication in the 80s, and I don't know, probably the 90s as well. There was this program called Record Breakers. You remember Record Breakers? It was hosted by a guy called Roy Castle. And at the end of it, Roy Castle always sang this song about dedication. And he says, dedication, that's what you need. If you want to be the best, or if you want to be the best, and if you want to beat the rest, dedication, that's what you need. And that's so true. If you want to be the best, then dedication is required. Very often, what separates someone who is successful to someone who is unsuccessful is purely down to dedication, that they haven't given up, that no matter how many times something has come against them and something has tried to hinder them and hold them back, they're still dedicated to the goal and to the dream and to the ambition. And so no matter how many setbacks they get, they still keep coming back fighting. Rocky says it best, it's not about how many times you get hit and you get knocked down. It's about how many times you get knocked down, but you get back up again. Dedication. Read a quote during the week. Let me see if I can remember it. Something along the lines of, if you have a goal, a dream, or an ambition, then you will find a way. If you're dedicated to that goal, if you're dedicated to that dream, if you're dedicated to that ambition, you will find a way. If you're not, you will find an excuse. And how often do we hear from people about saying, yes, I'm with you, I'm there, I've got your back, I'm dedicated to you, I'm dedicated to this cause, I'm dedicated to whatever it is that we're talking about, and then the first time that you've got to meet up, I'm busy. I've got to do this, there's an excuse. God is looking for a people that are dedicated, to be holy and totally committed. You see, athletes that are dedicated know there's got to be sacrifice. This has got to be the main thing. This has got to be the focus. I can't have any distractions. And so athletes very often, they leave their families behind and they'll go away to a training camp for, I don't know, maybe 2-3 months. And it's morning, noon, and night, non-stop training because they've got a goal. They've got a dream, they've got an ambition, and they're dedicated to the achievement of that goal, dream, and ambition. They're not finding any excuses. Dedication requires sacrifice. Dedication requires whenever everybody else is going out to the parties, you're in bed. Whenever everybody else is eating a Chinese, you're eating a salad. Whenever everybody else is hanging out with their family, you're out on the road running by yourself at 6 o'clock in the morning or at 10 o'clock at night. Dedication, that's what you need to be holy and totally committed. Give me just a few more minutes and then we'll finish. Let me ask you a question as I come to a close. What is it that you're dedicated to? What is it that you have been dedicated to during parts of your life? And is it really worth it? Is it really worth it? Is my dedication to Liverpool Football Club really worth it? No. I need to pick different questions. See, we can dedicate all our time and our money and our energy to these things, and in the end, we got to ask the question, was it really worth all that time, money, and effort? Was it really worth it? Jesus puts it probably best this way. He says, do not store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. Do not store up treasures on earth where Burnley can take points off you. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust don't destroy. You see, Jesus is talking about eternity here. He's talking about being dedicated to the eternal things because the earthly things will pass away. And we can be dedicated to so many things. We can sacrifice for so many things that in the end will just pass away anyway. And we can spend so much time and energy and money being dedicated to these things that in 10, 20 years' time are going to be forgotten about, are going to be gone. And so Jesus is saying, listen, I want you to think about eternity here. I want you to think about being dedicated to storing treasures in heaven because that's what matters and that's what counts. There was a guy by the name of C.T. Studd. Well, you'll have heard this before. He coined the phrase, only one life will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Everything that we do in storing up our treasures on earth, we can't take them with us. We can be billionaires. I was watching a program during the week about the world's most expensive cars, and these guys turning up and paying £1 and £1.5 million for a car. Looked amazing, but they're walking in and writing a check like I would spend a tenner. £1.5 million on a car. And I'm thinking, my goodness, you cannot take that with you. Let's put another way in the Bible. What is it to gain the whole world and yet lose your soul? We can gain everything on this earth, but what really counts is eternity. And so I want to urge you as I come to a close, I want to challenge you, I want to present to you and encourage you to dedicate yourselves to Jesus Christ. Dedication means to set yourselves apart. Set yourselves apart from the way that you've been living. Set yourselves apart from the things that you've been dedicated to up until now. Set yourselves apart from storing up treasures on the earth and begin to set yourselves apart so you're starting to store up treasures in heaven where it all counts and where it all matters. Paul writes it this way in writing to the Romans: offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Offer yourselves to God. Dedicate yourselves to God. Present yourselves to God. The Bible is filled with people who have been dedicated. Filled with stories of men and women of God who have been dedicated to Him and dedicated to the call that has been on their lives. Moses, the little baby that was in the basket that was sent down the river Nile, that was picked up and was brought up in Egypt, but he ended up in the wilderness. And God called him and sent him back, set him apart to go back to Egypt to set the captives, to set the children of Israel free. And while at first Moses was reluctant, I don't want to dedicate myself to this, God. But God wasn't taking no for an answer, and God kept on at him. And eventually Moses said, okay, I will go. And Moses dedicated himself to God and dedicated himself to the call that was on his life to go back to Egypt and to set the captives free. He brought them out of captivity. He brought them through the wilderness, leading them away from captivity. And Moses doesn't get to take them into the promised land, but God raises up another man by the name of Joshua. And Joshua, again, is dedicated to God and dedicated to the call that is on his life. And that is to lead the children of Israel into the promised land and to establish them as a nation. And Joshua leads these armies. He leads the armies of Israel to take the land, to take possession of the land, because he's dedicated. He put his foot in the ground and he says, yes, God, I'm going to do it. I know there's going to be sacrifice required, and that's okay. I know there's going to be hindrances that come my way, but I'm going to get over the hindrances because I'm dedicated to you, God, and I'm dedicated to the call that you've placed on my life. Just a couple more minutes. We need to be dedicated to God. We need to be dedicated to what He has called us to the things that He has called us to. As a church, what does it mean to be dedicated? Let me share just a very brief story, just in coming to a close. A number of years ago, it was in my kind of early 20s, and I was working a job as I was a courier. And I would have to go into work at it was in for 6:30 in the morning, and I was loading up a van, and I was then taking the van out around the streets of East Belfast and up into Carryduff. And I was starting at 6:30 in the morning and getting finished at about 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. And then nearly every night I was involved in stuff within the church. I was leading the youth at that time, so I had a drop-in on a Wednesday night, a youth club on a Friday night. And we done a home group in Anne Graham's house on a Tuesday night. And then we done a youth church on Sunday night. So it was a church on Sunday morning, and then we run a separate youth church on Sunday night. And at times I was drained. I couldn't do it now. I got away with it then because I was a lot younger and I had a lot more energy about me. But I was dedicated. I was dedicated to God. I was dedicated to this church. And I was dedicated to the things that God had placed within my heart and within my spirit. I was dedicated, and that required sacrifice, and it was tough. But I knew what was required, and I wasn't going to let it go. It was very difficult at times because I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I knew there was a better calling, a different calling on my life, that God had planned and purposed something for my life within ministry. And I knew that was not a part of it, but I had to go through that process. And I remained dedicated to the call of God on my life. You see, if we're going to see this church grow, if we're going to see this church develop, if we're going to see this church mature, then we've got to be dedicated. I'm speaking specifically to New Life City Church. We've got to be dedicated to God. We've got to be dedicated to the call that God has placed on our lives and on the life of this church. Dedication requires something at times so very simple, like showing up on time. Dedication requires praying over this church. Dedication then requires sacrifice. So rather than sitting in the house and watching EastEnders or watching a football match that you're saying, I'm going to go down. I'm going to go to church. The Monte is on this weekend. The Monte is on Saturday night. I'm going to be there. Forget the X Factor. I can tape it and get it on Sky Plus. I'm going to be down with the Monte. I'm going to see what God has to do for me tonight. Some of you missed it last night. You missed what God had for you last night because you sat in the house. Dedication requires getting up out of your seat and coming down to church on time. Dedication requires getting involved. Dedication will require sacrifice, church. But for those that aren't Christians, dedication requires setting yourself apart and saying, God, I want to know what you have for me. Because your plans and your purposes are eternal. And what I do for you will echo in eternity. What I do for you will carry through to eternity. Dedication. What are you dedicated to? Dedicate yourselves to God. Dedicate yourselves to what He has for you. And whenever you do that, He will help set you apart. And He will help you store up treasures in heaven where moth and rust and don't destroy. And as John Darby said earlier on, we're going to come face to face with Jesus. We're going to come face to face with Jesus. And He's going to introduce us to the treasures we had stored up. And there, we'll spend eternity with Him. There, we'll spend eternity with Him. What an amazing joy, what an amazing thing to look forward to. Well, I'm going to be there. And I encourage you as you leave this place today that you make sure you're one of those people that is dedicated to God.